It was old man Tiber's cough, rattling like dry leaves in the autumn wind, that first brought the whispers to my ears. I was just 10 then, small for my age, with knobby knees perpetually scraped from climbing the ancient oak behind our cottage. The world, to me, was a map of puddles after a rain, the scent of wood smoke from my mother's hearth, and the endless tales spun by the village elders during the long, dark evenings. Our village, Oak Haven, nestled deep in the valley, was a place where time moved with the rhythm of the seasons, and ancient stories clung to the cobblestones like moss. The grand stone walls of the convent of St. Agnes, perched on the hill overlooking us, were as much a part of our horizon as the sun itself. It was a silent sentinel, a place of mystery and solemnity, and for a boy like me, a source of endless, sometimes fearful curiosity. Man Tiber was our village's chronicler, though he carried no quill or parchment. His memory was his library, and his words, etched with the wisdom of 80 years and the rustle of 1,000 anecdotes, were our most treasured inheritance. He sat by the communal fire pit that particular night, his gnarled fingers tracing patterns in the dirt, his eyes, watery and ancient, fixed on something far beyond our flickering flames. The air was thick with the chill of impending winter, and the scent of damp earth mingled with the comforting aroma of baking bread from the nearby ovens. My younger sister, Ilara, was nestled against Mother's skirts, already half asleep, but I, perched on an overturned bucket, was wide awake, my ears pricked like a fox's. "And they say," Tiber rasped, his voice barely a whisper. Yet it cut through the usual hum of evening chatter, that she rests uneasy still. A hush fell over the small gathering. The usual gossip about straying sheep or dwindling harvests vanished. My father, usually gruff and practical, leaned forward, his brow furrowed. I felt a prickle of unease, a cold sensation that wasn't just the evening air. This wasn't a story about mischievous sprites or brave knights. This felt different, darker. "Who, man Tiber?" Father asked, his voice low. Tiber shifted, his eyes now finding mine, as if he knew the story would burrow deepest into a young, impressionable mind. "The nun," he said, the single word hanging in the air, heavy and full of unspoken meaning. "The one they buried twice." My heart gave a strange little thump against my ribs. Twice? How could a person be buried twice? The idea felt wrong, like trying to fit two shadows into one space. I had seen burials, our village had its share of them. The slow procession to the churchyard, the priest's solemn words, the gentle thud of earth on the wooden coffin. It was final. It was absolute. To be buried twice suggested something else, something not final, something unfinished. The other villagers exchanged glances. I could feel the weight of their unspoken knowledge, a secret language shared between adults woven into the very fabric of Oak Haven. It made me feel small and ignorant, yet fiercely determined to understand. "The year of the great fever it was," Tiber continued, his voice regaining a little strength, a storyteller finding his rhythm. 20 years ago, perhaps more, before many of you were but babes." He gestured vaguely towards the younger adults, then back to me, making me feel connected to a history I hadn't lived. The fever swept through the valley like a vengeful spirit. No family was spared. The church bells tolled from dawn till dusk, a mournful dirge for the dying. I remembered my grandmother, who had passed 2 years prior, speaking of that time. Her voice had always held a tremor when she mentioned the great fever, a time when even the strongest fell, and the living moved like ghosts among the dead. The convent, being a place of succor, had been particularly hard hit. The nuns, true to their vows, had ministered to the sick, offering comfort and prayers, often at the cost of their own lives. Sister Agnes, Tiber enunciated slowly, his gaze distant, or rather Sister Maria, as she was known before she took her vows. A young woman, barely 25, they said, fair of face, gentle of spirit. She came from a noble house, but renounced all for God. She was tireless during the fever, tending to the ailing with a devotion that shamed us all. She prayed without ceasing, her voice a soft murmur, even in the face of death. He paused, a deliberate silence that tightened the knot of anticipation in my gut. I imagined her, a shadowy figure, in a habit moving through dimly lit rooms, her hands cool on fevered brows. It was a common enough scene from our village history, yet Tiber's telling imbued it with a chilling uniqueness. Then the fever took her, he said, his voice dropping again, just as it had taken so many others, or so they thought. One morning, the other sisters found her still in her cell, her skin cold, her breath gone. Her face was serene, they said, as if she had simply drifted into a holy sleep. This was where the story began to twist, where the familiar path of death veered into the unknown. We all knew what happened when someone died. The washing of the body, the dressing in burial shrouds, the last respects. It was a sacred, unchanging ritual. But the way Tiber spoke, it was clear that Sister Maria's story hadn't followed the customary path. The fever was so rampant, Tiber explained, his gaze sweeping over our faces, seeing our unspoken questions. The dead were piling up. There was little time for the usual rites, for the customary 3 days of vigil. Fear gripped the valley, a cold hand around every throat. The living scarce had strength to bury the dead. He shifted, leaning back against the rough stone of the fire pit. So, with heavy hearts and haste, the abbess herself, Mother Superior, Isolda, ordered Sister Maria's burial. They wrapped her in a simple shroud, laid her in a plain wooden coffin, and carried her to the convent's own consecrated ground, just behind the chapel. It was a small ceremony, only a few sisters present, their faces masked by grief and fear of contagion. My mind conjured the image, the hurried burial, the silence broken only by muffled sobs and the quick scraping of shovels. It felt disrespectful, unsettling, even to my young mind. Death deserved dignity, not haste. But then again, I wasn't there. During the great fever, I couldn't imagine the terror that would drive such actions. The earth covered her, Tiber said, and the sisters returned to their duties, their ranks thinned, their spirits heavy. They believed they had laid a saintly soul to rest, a martyr to the fever. And that, they thought, was the end of Sister Maria's story. He paused, a long, dramatic pause, allowing the silence to stretch, to amplify the tension. The fire crackled, spitting embers into the night. Alara stirred in her sleep, murmuring softly. I gripped the edge of my bucket, my knuckles white. I knew this wasn't the end. This was the first burial. The story was called The Nun Who Was Buried Twice. But, Tiber said, his voice now a low rumble, it was not the end. Not for Sister Maria. For 3 days after her hasty burial, a gardener, a simple man named Thomas, was tending the rose bushes near the convent's small cemetery. He was an old man, hard of hearing, but his eyes were sharp, and his hands, though calloused, were sensitive to the slightest tremor in the earth. My breath hitched. The old gardener, the rose bushes. What could he have seen? What could he have felt? My imagination, already inflamed, raced ahead, conjuring impossible scenarios. Thomas swore later, on his dying breath, that he felt a faint vibration in the ground beneath his feet, Tiber narrated, his voice now imbued with a chilling certainty. A tremor. Not an earthquake? No. Something localized. As if something stirred beneath the earth. He dismissed it at first, attributing it to the wind rustling the branches overhead, or perhaps a mole tunneling. But Thomas, being a man of habit and deep connection to the earth he tilled, could not ignore it entirely. It persisted, a subtle rhythmic throb, faint but undeniable. He knelt, pressing his ear to the damp soil, listening intently. The other villagers, completely absorbed now, leaned in, their faces illuminated by the dancing firelight, reflecting the awe and apprehension in their eyes. Even my father, who usually scoffed at such tales, seemed utterly captivated. "And then," Tiber whispered, leaning closer, his voice dropping to a theatrical hush. "He heard it. Faint, muffled, but distinct. A scratching sound. From beneath the ground. And a cry. A weak, desperate cry, like a kitten trapped in a well. My blood ran cold. A cry from beneath the earth. It could only mean one thing. A shiver, not of cold, but of profound dread, traced its way down my spine. The image of Sister Maria, serene in death, was instantly replaced by a horrifying new one, alive, buried, screaming in the darkness. The thought was so terrifying, so utterly unimaginable that my mind struggled to grasp it. How could such a thing happen? How could anyone survive such a thing? Tiber's eyes, bright with the telling, held us all in their thrall. He knew the power of his words, the way they twisted and coiled around our deepest fears. The nun who was buried twice. The phrase suddenly took on a sinister, real meaning, far beyond a mere village legend. It became a chilling possibility, a nightmare given form. Thomas, old and infirm as he was, scrambled back, terrified, Tiber said, his voice now almost triumphant in its dramatic flair. He ran to the convent gates, banging on them with his rake, shouting, screaming about voices from the grave. The sisters, initially thinking he'd lost his mind, were reluctant to open, but his desperation, his wild, unblinking eyes, convinced them. The next day, the entire village was abuzz with whispers. News traveled faster than the river currents in Oakhaven, especially when it involved the convent and something so utterly unbelievable. I remember waking before dawn, the image of those frantic sisters digging at the earth still vivid in my dreams. The scent of pine from the forest clung to the morning air, but it did little to dispel the chill that had settled deep in my bones. My mother, usually humming as she prepared breakfast, was quiet, her brow furrowed, occasionally casting worried glances towards the distant hill where the convent stood, its silhouette stark against the paling sky. Children, usually eager for their morning chores or games, huddled together, speaking in hushed tones. We mimicked the adults, though our understanding was far more fragmented, pieced together from half-heard conversations and the exaggerated gestures of older siblings. What truly happened after the sisters started digging? That was the question. That hung heavy in the air, a mystery that even the most seasoned gossipers couldn't answer definitively, for no villager had been present during that horrifying retrieval. Only the sisters and old Thomas bore witness. It was later that day, when Father returned from the village forge, that we finally got more details, though still fragmented. Father had a way of cutting through the fanciful embellishments of village talk, extracting the core truth. He sat heavily at our small wooden table, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow, his face grim. "They found her," he stated, his voice low and heavy, as if the words themselves were a burden. He didn't look at me, but I knew he was speaking, for my benefit too, trying to offer a boy's mind some measure of understanding without unleashing the full horror. Still in her coffin, alive. A collective gasp from Mother and Elara. My own breath caught in my throat. Alive. After 3 days. In the dark. Buried. The concept felt alien, defying everything I knew about life and death. How could anyone survive that? What kind of miracle or curse was this? Thomas, Father continued, he swears she was barely breathing, her eyes. wide, unfocused, her hands clawed, raw from scratching at the lid. He paused, and I imagined the terror, the desperation of those last moments inside the coffin, the realization of what was happening. It made my skin crawl. The abbess, Mother Superior Isolde, she ordered them to carry her back to the infirmary immediately. She summoned the elder sisters, those with knowledge of healing herbs and ancient remedies. They worked over her for hours trying to coax life back into her fragile body. My imagination ran wild. I pictured Sister Maria, a ghostly figure, pale and weak, gasping for air, her mind perhaps still trapped in the suffocating darkness of the grave. The thought was unbearable. Had she cried out for help? Had she screamed? Or had her voice been lost to the earth, a silent agony endured alone? Father then spoke of the explanations offered by the convent. The great fever, it was said, could induce states of profound unconsciousness, mimicking death so perfectly that even experienced healers could be fooled. It was a rare, terrifying phenomenon, but not unheard of in times of such widespread pestilence. The sheer number of deaths had led to haste, and haste, in this case, had led to a terrible, almost unforgivable error. They say it was God's will, Father muttered, more to himself than to us. A test of faith, a second chance. But even as he spoke the words, his tone lacked conviction. There was something in this story that unsettled even the most devout among us. A feeling that transcended simple medical explanations or divine intervention. It was a violation of the natural order, a glimpse into a terrifying what-if that no one wanted to contemplate. For days, the convent remained shrouded in an intensified silence. The usual sound of the Vespers bell seemed muted, and even the crows that nested in the ancient oaks around the convent seemed to fly with a new solemnity. No one saw Sister Maria. No one knew if she had truly recovered or if she was still lingering, a shadow of her former self. The villagers, myself included, waited with bated breath, eager for any news, any sign that the world had righted itself after such a profound upheaval. Then, one crisp autumn morning, a different bell tolled from the convent, not the mournful dirge of the fever, nor the daily call to prayer. This was a slow, deliberate toll, a summoning. Father, along with other village elders, went to the convent. I begged to go, but was told firmly that it was not a place for children, especially not now. The air crackled with a strange mix of anticipation and dread. When Father returned that evening, his face was still solemn, but there was a flicker of something new in his eyes, awe, perhaps, or a deep, unsettling reverence. He didn't speak immediately, but sat by the fire staring into the flames. Finally, Mother couldn't hold back. "What happened, Thomas? What did they say?" Father took a deep breath. "They held a service. A private one at first, with only the sisters. Then they invited the village leaders, and a few others deemed worthy." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "They brought Sister Maria out." My heart hammered. This was it. The moment of truth. What did she look like? Had the ordeal changed her beyond recognition? "She was thin," Father recounted, his voice hushed. "Pale, almost translucent. But her eyes, they held a light," they said. "A strange, knowing light. As if she had seen things beyond the veil. Things no mortal was meant to witness." He rubbed his calloused hands together, a nervous gesture I hadn't seen from him often. "She did not speak, not a word, but the abbess, Mother Superior Isolde, spoke for her. And this was where the story truly took its turn into the extraordinary, leaving the realm of medical anomaly and entering something far more profound. Mother Superior Isolde declared it a miracle, Father explained, his voice gaining a quiet intensity. A divine intervention. Sister Maria had returned from the precipice, touched by God Himself. But she also said that Sister Maria had returned with a sacred purpose, that her ordeal had granted her a unique spiritual insight. My mind struggled to comprehend this. A unique spiritual insight gained from being buried alive. It seemed a terrifying price to pay for enlightenment. What kind of insights could one gain in such darkness and terror? They said she was no longer. "Simply Sister Maria," Father continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "But Sister Maria of the grave. And from that day forward, she would live a life of even deeper seclusion, dedicated entirely to prayer and penance for the souls of the departed and for those who had suffered in silence. This was the reason for the second burial, though not a physical one in the way I had imagined. It was a symbolic burial, a reinterment of her old self, a rebirth into a new, more profound spiritual existence. The village accepted this narrative, though beneath the surface, a tremor of unease persisted. The idea of someone returning from the grave, even for a holy purpose, was something that challenged the very foundations of our understanding. Over the next few months, the legend of Sister Maria of the grave grew. Tales circulated of the strange glow that sometimes emanated from her cell window late at night, a soft, ethereal light that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Some villagers claimed to have seen her, a fleeting glimpse of a pale face framed by a dark habit, watching them from the convent's highest windows, her eyes holding an ancient sorrow. Children, myself included, would sometimes dare each other to venture close to the convent walls at dusk, half hoping, half fearing, to catch a glimpse of the nun who had walked back from the dead. The convent itself became even more of a silent, imposing presence. Visitors were rare, and the few who were granted entry spoke of an almost palpable aura of sanctity, yet also of a lingering melancholy within its ancient stones. The sisters moved with an even greater quietude, their prayers seeming to carry a deeper weight. Old man Tiber, when he next spoke of it, would add a new layer to the narrative. "They say," he'd murmur, his eyes distant, "that she never truly recovered from the cold earth, that a part of her soul remained bound to the grave even after her body returned. That's why she rests uneasy still, because even in life, she was half buried." That phrase, half buried, resonated deeply with me. It was a chilling thought of existing in a liminal space between life and death, forever marked by an experience so profound and terrifying. It made Sister Maria not just a miracle, but a tragic figure, a silent testament to the thin veil between our world and the next. The mystery of her survival, while attributed to divine will, never fully explained the lingering sense of awe and dread she inspired. And the whispers continued, weaving themselves into the fabric of Oakhaven, passed down from generation to generation, a timeless tale of the nun who was buried twice, and who, even after her miraculous return, carried the shadow of the grave within her. My 10-year-old mind couldn't fully grasp the complexities of faith or the depths of human suffering, but I knew, with the certainty of a child who has heard a truly unsettling story, that Sister Maria of the grave was a figure of profound significance, a living legend etched into the very soul of our quiet valley. Life in Oakhaven, after the astonishing return of Sister Maria, settled back into its familiar rhythms, yet beneath the surface, a new thread had been woven into the tapestry of our existence. The convent, once a distant, revered landmark, now held an even deeper mystique. It was no longer just a place of prayer, but a sanctuary touched by something profound, something both miraculous and unsettling. For me, the whispers about Sister Maria of the grave didn't fade with time. If anything, they grew sharper, fueled by my growing imagination and a child's relentless curiosity. I was a year or two older now, perhaps 12. My knobby knees were still scraped, but my world had expanded beyond puddles and wood smoke. It now included the thrill of secret expeditions with my friends, venturing further into the forest, exploring forgotten paths, and, inevitably, finding ourselves drawn to the silent stone walls of the convent of St. Agnes. We'd sneak through the thinning woods, our boots crunching on fallen leaves, our hearts thumping with a mixture of fear and excitement. Our goal was simple: to catch a glimpse of Sister Maria of the Grave. Most of the time, our efforts were in vain. The convent was a fortress of quiet piety. We'd see the other sisters, their dark habits a blur against the gray stone, going about, their duties in the gardens or moving between buildings. But Sister Maria was different. She was a ghost story, a whispered legend, and her presence was rarely, if ever, seen by outsiders. This only deepened her allure. One crisp autumn afternoon, bolder than usual, my friend Finn and I ventured closer than ever before. The air was still, pregnant with the scent of burning leaves from distant farms. We crept along the edge of the convent grounds, keeping to the shadows of the ancient oak trees that lined the property. The leaves were a riot of red and gold, but they offered little cover. "Think she's really up there?" Finn whispered, his voice barely audible, his eyes wide as he gazed at the highest windows of the convent. I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. "Tiber says her cell is in the highest tower. That's why the light glows sometimes." We found ourselves near the small walled cemetery where Sister Maria had been, for a time, buried. The ground was meticulously kept, the gravestones worn smooth by time and weather. A few freshly dug plots indicated recent burials, the inevitable cycle of life and death continuing even after such an extraordinary interruption. A shiver ran down my spine. This was the place. The earth here had once held her, just as we were. About to retreat, convinced our quest was fruitless, a sound reached us. It wasn't a cry or a scream. It was a faint, almost melodic humming. It seemed to float on the wind, carrying a haunting beauty that transcended the simple notes. It was unlike any sound I had ever heard from the convent. Finn and I exchanged glances. My heart pounded against my ribs like a trapped bird. We instinctively moved closer, drawn by the mysterious melody. It seemed to emanate from a small, secluded courtyard, tucked away behind a tall hedgerow, a place we had never dared to approach before. Peering through a gap in the dense foliage, we saw her. It was Sister Maria. She was not in her cell, nor was she shrouded in the darkness of the grave as my imagination had often depicted her. She sat on a simple stone bench in the sun-dappled courtyard, surrounded by vibrant autumn flowers. Her habit was the same as any other nun's, but her posture was profoundly different. She sat utterly still, her back straight, her hands clasped loosely in her lap. Her face, framed by the white wimple, was indeed pale, almost luminous, and seemed carved from moonlight itself. But it was her eyes that held me captive. They were open, gazing upward at the vast clear sky, but they held an unfathomable depth, as if seeing beyond the clouds, into something eternal and boundless. The day. Humming came from her. It was a wordless melody, a mournful yet incredibly peaceful sound that seemed to transcend human language. It was a song of sorrow, yes, but also of profound acceptance, a melody that spoke of infinite patience and a quiet understanding of things beyond my grasp. She wasn't frail or trembling as I had imagined. There was a quiet strength about her, a stillness that was not weakness, but rather a profound inner calm. She seemed connected to the earth beneath her, to the sky above, and to something I couldn't name. Finn gripped my arm, his knuckles white. I could feel his trembling, mirroring my own. We were witnessing something sacred, something profoundly personal, and we felt like intruders. Yet we couldn't tear our eyes away. Then she slowly lowered her gaze. Her eyes, those deep, knowing eyes, swept across the courtyard, and for a terrifying, heart-stopping moment, I thought she saw us. My breath hitched. I squeezed my eyes shut, expecting a gasp, a cry, a summons from the other sisters. But when I opened them, she was simply standing. Slowly, gracefully, as if moving underwater. She rose from the bench. She didn't look towards our hiding spot. Instead, she walked towards a small, unadorned wooden cross at the edge of the courtyard. It was clearly a marker, but unlike the elaborate gravestones in the cemetery, this one bore no name, no dates. It was simply a cross, planted in the earth. She knelt before it, her humming fading into a silent reverence. She remained there for a long time, her head bowed, her silhouette perfectly still against the setting sun. We watched, mesmerized as the light faded, casting long purple shadows across the courtyard. The air grew colder, and a single star pricked the darkening sky. Finally, she rose again, with the same unhurried grace. Without a backward glance, she turned and walked towards a small door in the convent wall, which we now realized led directly to her secluded part of the convent. Just before she disappeared inside, she paused for a fleeting moment, and then she turned her head, slowly, and looked directly towards the gap in the hedge where we stood. Her eyes, even from that distance, seemed to bore into mine. There was no anger, no accusation, no fear. Only that same deep, knowing light and a profound, almost ancient sadness. It was a look that seemed to see through me, into me, understanding things I didn't even know about myself. It wasn't a warning. It was something far more potent. It was an acknowledgement. Then, she was gone. The door closed silently behind her, leaving the courtyard empty, bathed in the growing twilight. Finn and I didn't speak for a long time. We stumbled back through the woods, the crunch of leaves now deafening in the silence. The experience had been nothing like we expected. It wasn't frightening in the way a ghost story was. It was humbling, profound. That night, back in my bed, staring up at the familiar wooden beams of our cottage, I couldn't shake the image of her eyes. They weren't the eyes of someone who had merely survived a terrible ordeal. They were the eyes of someone who had journeyed to a place beyond human comprehension and returned forever changed. Old Man Tiber's words echoed in my mind. Half buried. Now, I understood a little more what he meant. She was still here, in our world, but a part of her soul, or perhaps her understanding, remained connected to the silence and the secrets of the grave. She carried it with her, a quiet, almost beautiful burden. And I knew from that moment on that the story of Sister Maria of the Grave was far more than a village legend. It was a living truth, woven into the very air we breathed. In Oak Haven,